Ukraine now manufactures, I believe it's in terms of conventional drones of all times, probably about 40 times what the rest of European Nato manufactures in a year. There's tremendous ingenuity there, but it's people that they've got an exhausted population. They've got a population that went away. The population of sophisticated city dwellers, no longer obedient to the state, who are very reluctant to return to this terrible grind. But I think that I think we will see something happen in Ukraine by the late summer, and I think NATO will have to take the lead. And there's one person we haven't talked about, and he's as cunning as a fox in his very quiet, very flat country way, probably one of the most experienced politicians of them all, and very different from his predecessors, Mark Rutte.
Let's come on, Robert, to what this may tell us about Trump's likely approach to Ukraine. Because if he's prepared to think this radically about Gaza, and a lot of people will be appalled by what he said, other people may be impressed by his ambition. But if he's prepared to think this radically about Gaza, what might he now do about Russia and Ukraine?
Well, he might be got back to be doing a Greenland on Ukraine. I'm reading in my latest copy online of the Kiev Independent, which I enjoy hugely. I mean, it's a really feisty, quite prejudiced, but everything is prejudiced in media and outlet from Ukraine piece. But they have this intriguing idea that Trump is after what Ukraine can offer in mineral resources, particularly REE, rare earth elements. And this is the real scramble, because the dominant power with REE, it's got a lot of it, but claims it's not enough in its own territory, is China. And this is really worrying Trump now, because, you know, that you do not get the materials, particularly for the electric car industry. He's after talking about REE kind of found in Greenland. There's a push to exploit against the great treaty, international treaty there, the mineral resources of Antarctica, and he'll come across a lot of local opposition there. But there's no smoke with this thing in the Kiev Independent about them being after REE without fire, because it is the way Trump sees it. What's in it for me? And what's in it for him is that it is quite clear that the main effort of Trump foreign policy at the moment, curiously, for all we've had in the past and in the first presidency, it isn't Russia. Now, you have to ask yourself, you know, it's Sherlock Holmes. Sorry, we're full of quotations today, but my favorite detective writers always refer to this lovely remark by Sherlock Holmes: there's nothing so deceptive as an obvious fact. And the obvious fact is, why is he not talking about Russia? He's talked about everything. He's talked about Russia, he's talked even about the UK and about Starmer, but he hasn't really emphasized Putin, who was supposed to be at one time his very, very best friend. It's because he knows that the two powers are about to knock themselves out, or are in the slow process of knocking themselves out. It's as if David and Goliath are actually knocking each other to the ground in Ukraine and Russia, because there's no doubt about the real weakness of Russia there, by the way, although they're gaining ground, which we hear, and to horrific losses on both sides, is that they have never gained air dominance. They have never dominated the main battle space. And this is where Ukrainian ingenuity is outflanking, particularly when you see, there's a new flock of drones from Russia. They've got technology from China, which they have been sneaking through, dual-use stuff. And they've had, of course, the Shaheeds from Iran, and they're making them themselves, but they have never managed to do that. Meanwhile, Ukraine is losing, but it's blowing up refineries left and right, and it's killing people It's assassinating people inside Moscow. And it's very interesting. As far as Ukraine is concerned, temporarily, James, it seems to be on hold in Trump land, because he wants to get to a resolution which, and one can understand it, which requires minimum resources from the US. It's so strange that he said that the US could take over the Gaza Strip. It can't. It doesn't have the resources. It doesn't want to be involved in peacemaking, in the tangled peacemaking in Ukraine, or which we should say the eastern marches of Europe proper. And that's where his main aim is to crank up the Europeans, say, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to run your regime. And those on the front line, Poland, Finland, and the Baltics, just to pick them out, really do understand that. And where the on-off commitment of the three major Northern European powers militarily, Britain, France, and Germany, it is very, very ambivalent and ambiguous because of the very strange politics in all three. And Britain is no exception with this, because the Starmer government, if it has demonstrated anything, it does not understand the projection or the threat of the projection of force in a sophisticated foreign security and resilience policy. It really does not understand it. It's as if when they were at their schools, and they're very, very emphatic about the kind of public education they had, good for them. It's as if the use of military power, the utility of force, as Rupert Smith puts it, was never on the agenda, either in their college, school, or university courses. And I'm seeing this more as a real weakness. And since we're talking to a British audience, you look at the very slow motion train crash that seems to be emerging over the Strategic Defence Review, because it was supposed to be a reform, a modernization, an updating of the outlook, as well as the capability of the British military in its wider implications, as happened in 1998 under George Robertson in Tony Blair. George Robertson must be having nightmares, because he has been told by the Accounts Department, namely the Treasury, cut, or do not spend any money. You've got enough money. And Trump won't take that, by the way, because the one thing that is absolutely clear is that when it comes to the summit of NATO in The Hague at the end of June, they will be told that they have to modernize and they have to develop a capability on their own. They cannot rely on the deep strength of the US in power projection. And this is taken for granted in communications and intelligence, ISTAR, targeting, but particularly in transportation and logistics. The Western European NATO allies are almost bereft at doing anything serious and sustained, as was proved in Libya in 2011, without the Americans.
Well, and isn't there a lesson from Trump? You know, whatever you think about the specifics of what he's been saying in recent weeks, he is showing political imagination, and you need that sometimes to resolve these issues. I mean, yesterday on Frontline, I was speaking to the former UK Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, and he was saying, in his view, we should have long ago, but certainly we should be now, stationing NATO forces on training exercises in Ukraine, not on the front line, not in combat roles, but as a training force, because that also adds leverage for Ukraine ahead of potential peace negotiations.
Well, he's a fine one to talk, because he was the Armed Forces Minister. I'm sorry to be critical, and I don't go for the current government blaming everything on the Tories. But under his watch, the cut down of any serious Brigade Plus exercise was egregious. So he is absolutely right. They just don't take it seriously because we're so focus group driven. So if you are in the north where things are really deprived and difficult, would you one sort of a binary kind of question, a sort of polarity is, would you accept a cut or a restriction rather in the welfare and national health budget in order to boost defences? Well, it's obvious what the answer would be. So they take it as read. We're going to lose the northern wall, whether it's red, blue, pink, Farage, or whatever. And so they're focused on that. Instead, they should be devising a strategy, and it embraces very much, as I would say, a total reform and a radical outlook. And actually, we don't need bigger forces. We need stabilized but very modern forces. Really, not much more. Army around 70,000, serious reserve of 18,000. But we need huge reform if we're talking about resilience, which is part of this picture, of the health service and welfare. We cannot pretend this is 41 or 42 when William Beveridge produced his report that led to the welfare state. We cannot remain the unique advanced community that still believes that everything can be delivered, can be given free in medicine and healthcare at the point of delivery, and that bedevils everything.
Just a couple of questions to finish off, Robert. And as ever, we so appreciate your time. We could talk for hours. You mentioned the assassinations that Ukraine has been carrying out against Russia. We spoke back in December in the wake of the killing of General Kirillov in Moscow. This week, there's been another assassination in Moscow. Armen Sargsyan, the leader of a pro-Russian paramilitary group in eastern Ukraine, he was killed in an explosion in Moscow on Monday. What do you read into what appears to be now an organized and very effective campaign of assassinations by Ukraine against Russia?
I read General Budanov into this. I think there is some really smart, I fear, Machiavellian minds at the top in Kiev. Keep them on their toes. It's very interesting, as you say, that they've picked out a Chechen leader in a particular area of marginal warfare. There is a great fear that exotic means. We're seeing it at sea, what is really going on with the cables. It's very interesting how the Swedes have pulled back and say, oh, no, it's just bad navigation when one of the cables was lifted. One of the things, by the way, I must say that they fear in exotic warfare is that they will use chemicals. And I think that this accounts for the latest, and it's a warning. Budanov he's the director of intelligence, but he's really very, very close to Sersky at the top, and it has been running a formidably fascinating and very, very chilling propaganda war. And he is the master of psyops. And this is a psychological operation. The Chechens, we know, have been very important to Putin personally. And I think this also may be sending a little message saying we're getting quite close to you. It's quite interesting that the front is moving inexorably, but not very fast. But it's the psychology is still there. And part of the game is that we do hold a lot of cards, and there's a message to Trump about all of this, whether it's rare earth elements, whether it's the psychological campaign, whether it's the ingenuity in the close and the deep air war. They're saying to Trump particularly, don't count us out. You can't settle this by talking to Putin. You've got to talk to us. And that is what Zelensky is saying. And that's where there is the big battleground at the moment, because I think the Europeans will be saying that to Trump. You cannot do a fireside chat settlement. Look at the disaster of the two Minsk agreements. They never came to anything. And a lot of what Putin is proposing is a retread of the Minsk agreements. No NATO, neutrality, disarmament, get rid of Zelensky, give us the territory we've got, and a little bit more. Zelensky, he is in difficulty, but when he's looking at nearly 100,000 Russian troops being lost, killed, wounded, whatever, every 2 months at the moment, he knows things aren't looking too good in Moscow either.
And just finally on Zelensky, he gave an interview to Piers Morgan yesterday in which he said that if Ukraine isn't allowed to join NATO for the time being, then it should be either given nuclear weapons or allowed to develop its own. Do you agree?
I think it's a very clever move, because what he is doing is going back to the Budapest Agreement, which is what the Russians tried to ignore, whereby in 93, 94, was it that in Budapest, and Britain was a key broker in this, that they gave up their vast nuclear reserve, because a lot of the Soviet nuclear resources, the manufacture and the preparation for deployment, was in Ukraine, in order to have it understood that Ukraine would be an independent, sovereign nation. And this is the thing. Of course, it's well before Putin's time. It's 6 years or 5 years, 1999, that before Putin really gets to the apex of power, and Yeltsin hands over to him, and so he denies this. And but Zelensky is playing on that chord, and he's playing on something which is very interesting and very important and galling for the Russians, and it's why it makes Poland very strong and very vulnerable, in that they have a formidable defense industry. Ukraine now manufactures, I believe it's in terms of conventional drones of all times, probably about 40 times what the rest of European NATO manufactures in a year. There's tremendous ingenuity there, but it's people that they've got an exhausted population. They've got a population that went away. The population of sophisticated city dwellers, no longer obedient to the state, who are very reluctant to return to this terrible grind. But I think that I think we will see something happen in Ukraine by the late summer, and I think NATO will have to take the lead. And there's one person we haven't talked about, and he's as cunning as a fox in his very quiet, very flat country way, probably one of the most experienced politicians of them all, and very different from his predecessors, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. Mark Rutte has said, dangled in front of Zelensky and the Kiev Independent, my favorite thing, he has a secret plan. Whether he has one or not, I don't care. He is really taking the initiative in a way that the tougher Scandinavians, like Stoltenberg and the wonderful Danes that held that job, I think he's going to be an innovative Secretary General of NATO, because he knows what's going to happen. NATO is going to become more articulated. There's going to be European NATO, which will have to take charge of European affairs. And that is a demand where Trump has been articulate, has been relatively, for all the rhetoric, well, they've got to pay more money for their defense, but has been relatively, in his own terms, understated. But he really means it.
Robert, I love these conversations. I could talk to you for hours. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us once again on Frontline.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.